Okay, ready to dive in?
Absolutely, let's do it.
Today, we're going deep into the world of Arthur Nadel, a hedge fund manager who, well, he seemed to have it all figured out for a while anyway.
Right.
But then, boom, everything collapses. Turns out it was all a giant Ponzi scheme, leaving investors in total shock.
Yeah. A fascinating story, really. And it makes you wonder, was he some kind of financial visionary who went off the rails? Or was he always a con man, just really good at hiding it?
That's exactly what we're going to try and figure out today.
Should be interesting.
Now, one of the things that struck me right away was Nadel's background. I mean, this isn't your typical Wall Street story.
Not at all. Disbarred lawyer, piano player. It's like he was living multiple lives before he ever got into finance.
You know, that's what I thought too. It's almost like he was collecting experiences, adding to his, I don't know, his repertoire.
Right.
So I got to ask, do you think those experiences, those different paths he took, do you think they played a role in his, well, his ability to attract investors later on?
It's a really good question because, when you think about it, finance, it's not just about numbers. It's about trust. It's about confidence. It's about telling a story that people buy into.
And Nadel, well, he seemed to be a master storyteller.
He really did.
So let's talk about his hedge fund empire. I mean, this wasn't some small-time operation. 6 funds claiming assets of $330 million. And, get this, he's promising these insane returns. Like 11, 12% per month.
Per month.
Yeah, even during the 2008 crash, when everyone else was losing their shirts, he's saying, hey, come invest with me. You'll make a fortune.
It's almost hard to believe. I mean, who wouldn't be tempted by that? Especially during those crazy times.
Right. You've got this massive financial crisis going on. People are terrified. They're looking for any kind of stability, any way to protect their savings. And then along comes Nadel with this, I don't know, almost magical solution.
Yeah, he had this whole aura about him. Like he had cracked the code, figured out something nobody else had, and his pitch. A sophisticated computer program that could predict the NASDAQ like it was reading the future. I mean, come on, that's like a dream come true for any investor.
It's the kind of story that almost seems too good to be true.
Almost.
So what about this computer program? Was it the real deal, or was it all smoke and mirrors?
Well, that's where things start to unravel a little bit. When you look at Nadel's actual trading records, the picture gets a lot less impressive.
Oh, really?
Turns out he was, at best, a mediocre trader. Small profits when the market was doing well, big losses when things went south. He wasn't some kind of algorithm genius. He was barely keeping his head above water.
Wow. So if he wasn't making these incredible returns, how was he paying investors? I mean, the money was coming from somewhere, right?
That's the heart of it. Classic Ponzi scheme. He was using money from new investors to pay off the older ones, all the while siphoning off a big chunk for himself. Private planes, fancy houses, the whole 9 yards. He was living the high life on other people's money.
It's a classic tale, isn't it? The charismatic con man promising the impossible, building this facade of wealth and success, all built on a foundation of lies.
It really is, and for a while it works. But eventually, the house of cards starts to wobble.
And for Nadel, that wobble came in the form of, well, the 2008 financial crisis.
Right.
Markets crashing, everyone's panicking. Suddenly, investors are knocking on his door saying, hey, I need my money back.
And he just couldn't keep up.
So what did he do? What happens next?
Well, picture this. It's January 2009, just days before he's supposed to pay back like $50 million, and poof, he vanishes. Gone. Disappeared.
Wait, seriously? Just like that?
Yep, just like that. Leaves behind a note for his wife, admits the whole thing was a scam, tells her to take whatever cash she can get her hands on.
That's a dramatic exit. I mean, talk about going out with a bang. But he didn't stay gone forever, did he?
He didn't. Eventually, he turned himself in, pled guilty to a whole slew of fraud charges, got sentenced to 14 years.
Wow. And so that's the end of the story? Justice was served.
Not exactly. See, he died in prison just 3 years later, never really explained how he pulled it off or where all that missing money went. We're talking about an estimated $168 million just vanished into thin air.
So even after he's gone, he's still leaving a trail of questions and mysteries.
Exactly.
Now, looking back, were there any red flags? I mean, anything investors could have picked up on, anything that screamed, hey, this might be a scam?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, there's one big one that's almost unbelievable. Remember how we talked about Nadel being a lawyer?
Yeah.
Well, he wasn't just any lawyer. He was disbarred lawyer.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
Ah.
Disbarred. Kicked out of the legal profession. And the reason, get this, misappropriating client funds.
Hold on. So the guy who built a massive Ponzi scheme had already been caught stealing money before.
You got it. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. He also had a string of failed businesses. So it's not like this was a one-time thing. The guy had a history of, well, let's just say questionable financial dealings.
And still, people were lining up to give him their money. It's kind of mind-boggling. So what was it? Was it just charisma? Did he hypnotize people or something?
Well, charisma definitely played a part. Nadel was, by all accounts, a very charming guy, but I think it was more than that. It was trust. People trusted him because others trusted him.
Like a domino effect?
Exactly. He got recommendations from friends, from colleagues, even from, get this, a well-respected investment newsletter.
Oh, you're talking about that newsletter that gave him a glowing review.
Yeah.
The one that claimed they did all this due diligence and found everything to be on the up and up.
That's the one. Turns out they were on his payroll, getting millions in kickbacks to sing his praises.
Wow, so much for due diligence. I guess it just goes to show you can't always trust what you read, even if it comes from a supposedly reputable source.
Absolutely, and it's a good reminder for all of us, especially when it comes to our finances. Don't just take someone's word for it. Do your own research, ask tough questions, and if something feels off, walk away.
It's a shame, though, because for every Nadel out there, there are probably 100 legitimate financial advisors who are genuinely trying to help people. But because of guys like him, it's hard to know who to trust.
That's true. It erodes trust in the whole system. But getting back to Nadel, let's not forget the real victims here, the people who lost their life savings.
Right. Those weren't just numbers on a balance sheet. Those were real people, families, dreams that were shattered.
Absolutely. We're talking about retirees who were counting on that money to live out their golden years. Families who had to make huge sacrifices, maybe even lose their homes. The impact of this kind of fraud, it's devastating.
I remember reading a quote from one of Nadel's victims. He said, "It wasn't just the money, it was the betrayal. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut."
I can only imagine. To have that kind of trust shattered, it's got to be incredibly painful. And it's something we see again and again in these kinds of cases. It's not just about the financial loss. It's about the emotional toll, the sense of violation.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about Nadel, we've talked about his victims, but there's another group of people in this story that I want to get to, his partners. Specifically, Neil and Christopher Moody. They were running 3 of those 6 hedge funds. What was their role in all of this?
That's the question, isn't it? They've always claimed they knew nothing about Nadel's scheme, said they were just as shocked as everyone else when it all came crashing down.
But come on, they were his partners. How could they not have known?
Well, that's what the authorities wanted to know, too. The SEC investigated them, but ultimately they never faced any criminal charges. They did agree to a ban from the securities industry, though.
So basically a slap on the wrist.
Essentially, yeah. Which leaves a lot of people wondering if they really got off easy.
It's hard to imagine they were completely in the dark. I mean, they were managing millions of dollars. Surely there were some red flags, some signs that things weren't adding up.
Right, you would think so. But proving that they knew, proving intent, that's a whole other ballgame.
So the question of their complicity, it's still up in the air.
I think so. And it's something that a lot of Nadel's victims struggle with. They want answers. They want accountability. But sometimes, in these kinds of cases, the truth is just too murky to fully uncover.
It's a reminder that the financial world, it's a complex place. There are a lot of moving parts, a lot of players, and sometimes it's hard to tell who's pulling the strings, who's benefiting, and who's ultimately getting hurt.
Exactly. And it makes you think, what role do the institutions play in all of this? I mean, we've got the SEC, we've got the banks, we've got the lawyers. Are they doing enough to protect investors? Are there enough safeguards in place to prevent these kinds of schemes from happening?
That's a big question, and one that we could probably spend a whole other episode discussing. But for now, let's stick with Nadel. We were talking about his partners, the Moody's. But there's another institution that played a role in this story. The law firm, Holland and Knight.
Oh, right, them. They were involved in some of the legal work for Nadel's funds.
And they ended up getting sued, right?
Yeah.
For allegedly failing to disclose Nadel's past legal troubles.
That's right. The lawsuit claimed that if investors had known about Nadel's disbarment, about his history of misappropriating funds, they would have never invested with him.
That makes sense. So what happened? Did the lawsuit go anywhere?
Holland and Knight eventually settled for $25 million.
$25 million.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they never admitted any wrongdoing.
Of course not.
It's a common tactic in these kinds of cases. Settle the lawsuit to make it go away, but don't admit any fault.
It's frustrating, isn't it? I mean, $25 million, that's a lot of money. But it doesn't really answer the question of accountability. Did they know about Nadel's past? Did they turn a blind eye?
It's hard to say for sure, but the fact that they were willing to settle for such a large sum suggests that they might have had something to hide.
Yeah, it makes you think. Okay, so we've talked about the financial side of this story, the mechanics of the scheme, the victims, the alleged accomplices. But there's another aspect of Nadel's life that I want to explore, and it's a bit of a head-scratcher. His philanthropy.
Oh, right. Nadel, the philanthropist. It's an interesting wrinkle, isn't it?
It is. Because here we have this guy who's running a massive Ponzi scheme, stealing millions from people, but at the same time, he's donating generously to local charities, to the arts, even to a synagogue.
It's almost like he was trying to buy his way into heaven. Like, hey, I'm doing all this good, so maybe God won't notice all the bad stuff I'm doing over here.
Or maybe it was a way to deflect suspicion, like, look at me, I'm such a generous guy, surely I couldn't be capable of something like fraud.
Right. It's all about image. And for Nadel, image was everything.
I mean, think about it. He's got this extravagant lifestyle, he's throwing lavish parties, he's hobnobbing with the elite, and then he's also donating big bucks to charity. It's all part of creating this persona, this facade of success and respectability.
Exactly. And it worked for a while. People were impressed by his generosity. They trusted him because he seemed like a stand-up guy.
It was all built on a foundation of lies. And eventually, that foundation crumbled, leaving behind a trail of destruction and heartbreak.
You know, it's funny. We've been digging into the hows and whys of Nadel's scheme, the ins and outs of it all. But I keep coming back to his philanthropy. It's such a bizarre piece of the puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a real head-scratcher. I mean, here's a guy masterminding this huge Ponzi scheme, taking people for millions. But he's also out there, giving big to charities, to the arts, even donating to a synagogue. Like, what's the angle?
It's almost like a smokescreen, isn't it? A way to hide in plain sight.
Could be, or maybe it was a way to kind of, I don't know, offset the bad karma.
Right.
Like, if he did enough good deeds, it would balance out the bad. It's hard to say what was going on in his head, but there's this one story that really stuck with me. Apparently, Nadel once put on this whole piano concert for a fundraiser at a local hospital.
Really?
Yeah, played beautifully, apparently. And the event raised a ton of money for the hospital.
Wow.
It's almost Shakespearean, isn't it? This public display of generosity, this performance designed to tug at heartstrings. And all the while, he's living this massive lie. It makes you question everything.
No kidding. Was he trying to ease his conscience? Or was it just another calculated move to boost his image, make himself seem untouchable?
It's impossible to know for sure. But it does make you wonder, can you really be a philanthropist, a true philanthropist, if the money you're giving away is tainted? If it's built on a foundation of deceit?
That's a tough one. A real ethical dilemma. I mean, some people would say, hey, the money's going to a good cause, so who cares where it came from? But others would argue that you can't separate the good deed from the bad actions that funded it.
It's a gray area, for sure. And it kind of sums up this whole story, doesn't it? We've got this guy who was disbarred, yet convinced people to hand over their life savings. A charmer who lived like a king while secretly draining his investors dry. A generous giver whose philanthropy was, well, ultimately funded by lies.
It's a twisted tale, that's for sure. And it really challenges our ideas of good and bad, right and wrong, because with Nadel, it wasn't so clear-cut.
Exactly. So what was driving him? Was it just greed? A hunger for power? Or was it something deeper, some psychological need that we can't even begin to understand?
You know, some folks have suggested that Nadel might have had some narcissistic tendencies, that inflated sense of self-importance, the constant craving for admiration, lack of empathy for others. It's not a diagnosis, of course, but it does seem to fit with what we know about him.
It's an interesting thought, and it adds another layer of complexity to this already complicated story. It's not just about a con man and his victims. It's about the psychology of deception, the pull of charisma, and how even smart, savvy people can get caught up in these grand illusions.
Absolutely. Nadel's story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that we need to be wary of smooth talkers, of promises that sound too good to be true. And maybe most importantly, we need to trust our gut. If something feels off, it probably is.
Couldn't agree more. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the world of Arthur Nadel, a tangled web of finance, psychology, and human nature.
A wild ride, for sure. And I think the big lesson here is knowledge is power. The more we understand about how these schemes work, about the psychology behind them, the better equipped we are to protect ourselves and our loved ones.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and always remember, question everything.